Yes, the day will come fairly soon here where you can walk into the bank and ask for money without a mask on. It's a real privilege to be here today. I thank you for the invitation and have looked forward to this. We were a little bit late, partly because of the construction, partly because we were chasing a cow that got out, and I was. You're really risky people to ask somebody to introduce themselves. I'll just give you the Reader's Digest version. I was raised on a farm north of Edmonton at Westlock, and dairy farm, and so our Sunday mornings were get the milking done and go to church. I actually was reading your history here. My first experience of church life was in a Canadian Sunday school mission congregation that's still going strong in Clyde, Alberta. One of the graduates of the college that I worked at is serving there has served there for the last 10 years. So I was raised on a farm up there, and my misspent youth was throwing 100-pound cans of milk on the back of a truck every morning before school and taking them into the NADP, Northern Alberta Dairy Pool. I went to the University of Calgary, went to Alberta Bible College, taught in the Calgary school system for a couple of years, and then have had the privilege for the rest of my life working at Alberta Bible College in Calgary, where I served as director of field ministries for a number of years, and then as president for 27, I guess it was 27 years, and then as an academic dean for another 9 years. So we retired together, my wife and I. My wife was working in Calgary, and we retired 4 years ago and bought a little ranch, quarter section ranch, down in the Willow Valley, the other side, about 9 kilometers south of the Old Man River, and we have thoroughly enjoyed our retirement, semi-retirement really. It's one of those things where you always wonder how on earth you ever had time for a job when you retire, and we have cows grazing through the summer, but that's really the only agricultural stuff we do. And involved in some rotational grazing and things like that, trying to improve the land that we have. So that's pretty much the story, my story, and I'm sticking to it. I do enjoy these opportunities to preach. I used to do much more of it. I still serve as an elder in our congregation in Calgary, which has been an interesting experience over the last year, where you do it all by phone or by Zoom. But we hosted a little Bible study, collecting people from my shepherding group, and that worked very well. But I enjoy these opportunities for sharing as well. So thank you for the opportunity to share this morning. This morning I want to draw on a text that I think speaks directly to our times as we face a new future, an unknown future, despite what politicians are telling us, that we're going to go back to the way things have always been. I am not sure that that's going to be the case. There are already signs that things are going to be very, very different, even as things open up. But that doesn't mean that we live in a hopeless state. There are a great many ways to live life, And I want to talk this morning about how we hang on in uncertain times. So our text this morning is from Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 to 18. You can please turn to that and follow along if you wish. I'll be referring to other parts of chapter 1, but this will get us started. And this is the Apostle Paul facing a very, very uncertain future. And this is what he says. Now, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. Because of my chains, most of the brothers in the Lord have been encouraged to speak the word of God more courageously and fearlessly. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so in love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Philippians is often called the epistle of joy. 14 times in this epistle of 112 verses, Paul refers to joy or rejoicing. Paul had already learned rejoicing in Philippi. You remember the story in the process of planting the church there in Acts 16. He had healed a slave girl, and for his trouble, he and Silas are whipped and thrown into jail. And you remember what they did at midnight? They sang. And here he is in jail again, awaiting trial with his life on the line, when he writes all about joy all over again. Paul had just prior to our text offered this prayer for the Philippians. This is my prayer, he said, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless until the day of Christ, filled with the fruits of a good character that come through Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. And so Paul wants the church in Philippi to figure out how to love in the best way possible, how to reflect the love of Jesus in the best way possible, no matter the circumstances. Loving people doesn't and didn't come with a handbook. Loving people, which is at the heart of who God is and at the heart of his mission through us as people, needs to be worked out in every situation. And so Paul had prayed that their love would abound more and more, and that they would discern what is best, to have pure motives in the process, so that God's glory would be revealed in them through Jesus. Paul yearns for this young church that God's love would flow freely, so that many would be drawn to him. Now, there are all kinds of ways that one can express our faith. One can have a creedal faith based on a set of propositions. One can have an ethical faith based on a set of do's and don'ts. One can have a me-centered faith based on our own experience and how I feel about things. And one can have a political faith based on power and what one votes for. But authentic Christian faith stands in sharp contrast to these. It is relational all the way through. We worship a God who is love, John says, And when we do, love flows. And don't miss this, the love life of followers of Jesus arises out of character, out of God's character, and our character transformed through Jesus by his Spirit. Christian love, agape love, is triggered not by circumstances or conditions, but by character. Love flows even when plans are interrupted and things are chaotic. God's love ripples out of lives focused on him regardless of when life is unraveling. Even when things are a mess, a life without permanence, we are anchored to something that is permanent within the mess. As Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians 13, love endures. Only love is permanent. It's the only thing that is permanent. And so our text this morning gives a great example of just how this works out in the experience of the Apostle Paul. And I want to ask 4 questions about this text. One is, who were the people being touched by God's love through Paul? Number 2, what were the circumstances that he was called to love them in? And 3, how did he respond to those circumstances? And 4, why did he respond the way he did? Who were the people that love flows through in Paul's imprisonment? Verse 13 says, the whole palace guard knows I'm in chains because of Jesus. 13b says, everyone else. And we know who that everyone else is by looking at the end of the chapter, the saints in Caesar's household. Verse 14 says, most of the brothers in Rome have been encouraged to speak without fear. And in our own text, 15 to 18, those who preach Christ out of envy and rivalry and selfish ambition, stirring up trouble. So without validating their insincere motives, Paul loves them. He has bigger fish to fry. Jesus Christ is being preached. He loves Jesus. And of course, the Philippian congregation itself is encouraged in their partnership in sharing this to you with love story that is the gospel. Like water in the spring rains, it's seeping everywhere to both known and unexpected places, including those who are preaching from false motives. Number 2, just what were the circumstances that God's love flowed through Paul? He said, 12, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the good news of God's love for the world. At first blush, you'd think Paul was a little bit English. This is so understated. Now, I know he's probably just referring to the immediate circumstances of jail, but all the things that have happened to Paul that have brought him to this place is an amazing, amazing list in his life story. There's a detailed list that Paul himself gives in 2 Corinthians, and it's quite a catalog. 40 lashes 5 times, beaten with rods 3 times, stoned once and left for dead, 3 times shipwrecked, once in open water for a night and a day, no place to call homes with all the dangers of the road, flooded rivers, bandits, storms, in danger from this sect of the Pharisees who regarded him as a traitor and wanted him dead. And that catalog is only part of what happened to Paul. There are other false brothers. There are narrow escapes, being let down in a basket over Damascus walls because the gates had guards looking out for him to seek him. Narrow escapes by a lynch mob that required civil authority to step in and enlist a crack guard of 100 Roman soldiers to move him away from the mob. Has there ever been a good movie made on the Apostle Paul? I don't know, but there really should be. This guy lived on the edge, didn't he? He'd often gone without food and water and sleep, and proper clothing, inviting his friends to bring a cloak here and there. The daily pressure of my concern for the churches. What keeps him grounded when life plans change or interrupted? He'd wanted to go to modern Turkey, but one night in a dream he sees someone waving their arms and calling, "Come over here and help." And so Paul came to Philippi, planting the first European church. He'd planned on moving on from Ephesus, but stayed 3 years because God had opened a door. He'd wanted to visit a number of the churches again, but plans fell through. He dreamed of going to Spain. But now, after 5 trials, he sits chained to a guard 24/7 in Rome, awaiting his trial before Nero. And to add insult to injury, here in Rome, there are these people who are preaching Christ out of envy and rivalry and selfish ambition. We don't know who precisely these people are who are stirring up trouble for Paul, but we may get a clue from one of the second-generation leaders of the church, Clement of Rome. Writing in 90 AD, Clement said that Paul's enemies weren't just the Judaizers, the people who wanted Gentiles to become Jews before they became Christians. But there were within Rome and within the Gentile world generally, these enemies of Paul's and Paul's gospel. These wanted to take advantage of his imprisonment and his suffering. Again, we don't know the precise shape of this, but we know that there were those for sure in Corinth and probably throughout the empire for whom a suffering king was too much of a stretch, too much of a reach for what they understood to be a God who cares for human beings. Paul himself said of them that this self-giving God on a cross was foolishness to the Greeks. The Greeks loved heroes, you see. They loved honor. And here's this little man in jail speaking about a Messiah on a cross who is the Savior of the world. And neither the Greeks nor the Romans, who loved heroes and loved honor, neither of them could imagine a God who loved so much he was willing to suffer. And on top, of course, of all these detractors and dangers of living and working in the first century world and the threats to his life work, Paul has health issues. Some think it was eye problems, others malaria with its fevers. We don't know. But what has happened to Paul as he looks back through all of these circumstances, all of these things that has happened, that are in themselves quite a story, he looks back and says, all this for the sake of the gospel. Now, number 3, how did Paul respond to these circumstances? Thwarted plans and ambitions, broken dreams, hardships, imprisonment, uncertain future, mudslingers trying to undermine, health problems, are all pretty hard on the human body and the human spirit. We don't always know how we will respond until we're in these actual situations, but we can imagine, can't we? We can imagine that there might have been at least a few complaints, maybe some questioning about what I'd done to deserve all this, maybe at least a temptation to say life is too short, I'm out of here. We know people who've left the faith for less reasons, don't we? Maybe a little poor me thrown in. Maybe a few Facebook posts with pictures of the kids misbehaving. Maybe some regrets and wishful thinking. I wonder what life would have been like with that partner instead of the one I have. I think I'd wonder whether God might have gone away and forgotten me. Or was he just taking a snooze? Or was I under some sort of satanic attack? But Paul doesn't refer to any one of these things. There is no evidence at all of a pity party. For sure, a little, I wonder what is to become of me, thinking. We know this because in the passage that follows, he's thinking out loud about whether it would be better to continue encouraging the Philippians or going to be with the Lord. I'm sure I would have had other I wonder thoughts. I wonder what life would have been like if my plans had worked out to go to Spain. Or I wonder how the new churches are doing that I never got back to. I wonder. And yet, instead of drawing attention to himself or looking back in any way, he simply says, all that has happened to me has advanced the gospel. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. But instead of thinking of himself and his hardships, love flows. Love flows. Paul is not merely coping with his circumstances. Paul is thriving in the midst of his circumstances. And so we come to the fourth question. How is thriving possible? Why did Paul respond to his circumstances the way he did? Excuse me. What was the key to moving beyond coping to thriving? Just what did Paul see in those chains, in those circumstances? What enabled him to thread the eye of faith to see God's hand in all that had happened? Just what enabled Paul to love all people, his captors, his detractors, to love and to rejoice even in this mess he was in? One picture I can't get out of my mind when thinking about Paul took place earlier in Philippi, and I've already alluded to it. In his church planting foray at Philippi in Acts 16, he had freed this slave girl. She had made money for her handlers by soothsaying or prophesying for people, kind of like a palm reader at the Calgary Stampede. And her owners stirred up a mob and had Paul and Silas whipped and thrown into jail. And there at midnight with backs raw and bleeding, feet in big wooden stocks, being punished for bringing healing to another human being, there is this darkness in the inner cell, and voices and song. It's Paul and Silas singing. Have you ever heard of such a thing? Singing in the midst of a mess. Viktor Frankl, a Jewish psychiatrist with his entire family, were shipped to a Nazi concentration camp in the early 1940s. He and his sister survived and others perished. In his classic little book, Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl tells the story of those days in the camp. He tells of severe mental anxiety, the uncertainty for everyone of not knowing from moment to moment whether one was going to be cleaning out the ovens or fueling them. But his focus is on what he observed, that very often very healthy people in excellent physical health would give up and die. And how, on the other hand, very, very sick people, weak and dehydrated from dysentery and other sicknesses, would remain alive. And how sometimes not just alive, but with a positive attitude about life, and how they were looking forward to being reunited with family, or of writing a book of their experience, or composing a song, or making plans for a new business. And Frankl comes to this startling conclusion that the one who has a why to live can deal with any how. In other words, circumstances are not the primary determinant of life, that life hangs on a reason to live. And he observed that this is not a thin thread, but a strong cord. Now, having a purpose is a terrifyingly important and necessary thing. And Frankel has some very important things that we need to listen to. Having a reason to live is necessary, absolutely essential for coping. It can keep you going. You can move on from a car accident, a shattering divorce, a lost job. We can move on even from COVID, because we know they're only part of the story. But is a purpose sufficient for thriving? Can it produce songs at midnight? Can a bare purpose produce joy? And Paul would declare unequivocally, no. He would say no. He knew the deficiency of just a clear purpose. Prior to his call, you see, when he had been called Saul, he served a passionate purpose to protect the purity of Phariseeism. He was zealous, but there was not much singing in those days, not much joy. A purpose can help you survive, but not to thrive. Thriving, really living in joy, rejoicing at midnight, is rooted in something else. And Paul is inviting the Philippians and us into it. It is what enables him to hold his circumstances lightly, to not merely endure them, but to find joy in the midst of them. What's Paul's secret in dealing with the hardships, the interruptions, the chaos of life? Are you ready for this? Paul trusted God's purposes for his life. He trusted God's purposes, and he trusted God's processes for his life. God's work done in God's way will never lack for God's grace in the midst of them. I think this is at the root of singing at midnight. Paul saw his life as caught up in a much bigger story. Everywhere this is assumed in Paul's writing. And this morning's passage is sandwiched between two such references. One is Paul's prayer that we've already read, that the Philippians would learn the best ways to love others so that they might be pure and blameless in the day of Christ, to the glory of God. The other is Paul's reflection that to live is Christ, to die is gain. Paul knows that God's love is an anchor in shifting tides. It's permanent. It's eternal. It will never let him down. For me, to live is Christ, to die is gain. Alistair MacIntyre, one of the leading ethicists of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, says this: there is no point in asking what must be done until one has answered the prior question, what story am I in? You see, there are all kinds of ways we can respond to our circumstances because there are all kinds of stories that we can be part of. Paul's life is part of the greatest love story ever told. And so he sees what he goes through not just in terms of a moment. He understands through Christ that God is dealing with him not just for a few short years or a few short months, but forever. He sees himself caught up in the purposes of God that are cosmic in scope, that transcend space and time. For Paul, the mystery of God's provision for his life, that God was not bailing him out of jail, but blessing his life in jail, had to do with leaning into this big, big, big story. Was Paul missing out on his plans to bring the gospel to the whole Gentile world? No, 1,000 times no. In and through Christ, a fallen world was being stitched back together right there in Rome, chained to elite Roman guards. For me to live is Christ, to die is gain. Paul knew that the desire of God is to restore life as he created it to be, to reconcile all things to himself by making peace through the blood of his cross. Being part of this big story, Paul could see the purposes of God in the very circumstances he was entangled. Instead of whining, he sang and gave thanks. God, who is love, finishes what he starts. He never abandons. He outlasts everyone and everything. Paul knew that this God transcended his circumstances. Let me conclude with this, that love changes everything. Despite his own need, facing an unknown future, he was more concerned about those around him, palace guards, Caesar's household, the church back home, his detractors in Rome. Love turns competitors into colleagues. Love turns Caesar's prison into a beachhead for Caesar's palace. A sister confided in me not long ago that during a recent chemo treatment, she was with a doctor whose marriage was in trouble. She prayed for the doctor as she was being injected with chemo. What a picture. Gail could say with Paul, I want you to know that cancer has turned out for the advancement of the gospel. Dare we say that? In the midst of it all, God loves. In every dark circumstance, God's love sheds light. I know a guy who decided that he was feeling sorry for himself at Christmas time, and he'd reach out to a dozen or so neighbors in our COVID Christmas. And he made fudge and dropped it off to the neighbors. And they're still talking about it. I don't know what your circumstances are this morning. Some of them you can change and probably should change. But there are others you can do nothing about. You're chained like Paul, a prisoner. You've got a tiresome job or a tyrannical boss. Maybe you're chained to this husband or this wife who resembles a cellmate. Now don't look around on this one. More like a cellmate than a soulmate. Chained to those needy children or grandchildren or teens, or these senile parents, or these wearying studies. Maybe we see ourselves as members of a fellowship in a tiny town. Maybe you're in the prison of unemployment. Maybe you're wondering who invited those people to move in next door. Maybe the years have caught up to you and your health is holding you down with aches and pains. Chains can take many forms. But with chains rattling in the background tied to a Roman guard, Paul represents every one of us who has ever felt enslaved by circumstances. And he shouts across the years, God is at work here, especially here. In these broken circumstances, God is here. And as you surrender to his purposes and enter into them, you too can enjoy and watch love flow. You can sing at midnight. You can rejoice in those chains. It's not in a pill or a bottle. It's not in a trip to Europe. It's not in thinking positively. It's not even in trying to change the unchangeable. It's in a decision to surrender to this loving God of every circumstance. And so this morning, as I conclude, can I invite you to pray this prayer with me right where you are. Repeat after me this prayer. I'll say it, a phrase, and you repeat it after me. Lord, I surrender to you this morning.
Lord, I surrender to you this morning.
Give me eyes to see your loving purposes.
Give me eyes to see your loving purposes.
Give me a heart to enter them.
Give me a heart to enter them.
Please use me where I am.
Please use me where I am.
To love others.
To love others.
And I will rejoice in your love.
And I will rejoice in your love.
Amen.